I would like to introduce Mr. Paul Rosenzweig. He's the Senior Resident Fellow at National Security and Cybersecurity R-Street in USA. He works on legal and policy issues related to the cybersecurity, national security, and tech policy, including the intersection of privacy and security. In addition to his work at R-Street, Paul manages a cybersecurity consulting company called the Red Branch Consulting and teaches at the George Washington University School of Law. Previously, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the US Department of Homeland Security. Paul is also the author of a book called Cyber Warfare: How Conflicts in Cyberspace Are Challenging America and Changing the World. Mr. Paul's title of speech today will be Defending Forward and Persistent Engagement, America's Cyber Strategy. A very warm welcome to Mr. Paul Rosenzweig. Sir, the stage is yours now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Siddiqui. I appreciate very much the opportunity to join you today. It's really quite an honor for me to be invited to speak with you. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening in Pakistan. My topic today is America's cyber strategy, defend forward and persistent engagement. That strategy derives from a paradox. The paradox is that the United States has greater cyber capacity and capability than almost any other nation in the world. Perhaps it is preeminent, but it is certainly in the top ranks in terms of our capabilities and capacities to execute in the cyber domain, both commercially and as a government, offensively and defensively. Yet paradoxically, despite this seeming preeminence, the United States has, over the past decade and a half, suffered systematic vulnerabilities to cyber intrusions and attacks of one form or another. Our most secure database of security passage was hacked by the Chinese out of our Office of Personnel Management. One of our largest media companies, Sony, was nearly destroyed by North Korean hackers. US banks were subject to persistent attack from Iran. We've suffered a significant systematic theft of intellectual property from China. And of course, most recently in 2016, public reports suggested there was substantial, significant interference in the US elections by Russians, Russian-sponsored hackers. So the question is, why? How is it that a country with so much capability as the United States has could nonetheless be systematically so vulnerable to cyber attack from adversarial powers, whether they are state actors or in some case non-state actors? And the answer, after some analysis, we came to conclude lay in what we call here the escalation problem. America has a vast series of networks that are difficult, if not impossible, to defend completely. That makes America what we've come to describe as asymmetrically vulnerable to cyber attack from outside of our borders. Other nations therefore have what we might characterize, if we were talking about this in an international relations perspective and relating it back to the nuclear missile stage, escalation dominance. In other words, if we were, for example, to have responded to Russian election interference, there was a fear in the United States that our financial industry, for example, would be vulnerable to a countervailing attack from Russia. And so rather than being able to respond, the United States was stuck and remained stuck strategically with a series of relatively ineffective countermeasures. We engaged in a naming and shaming campaign against China that simply called it out for its intellectual property theft. And we, for example, put in what I think most of the world would say are ineffective sanctions against the North Koreans for the Sony hack. So where does that leave us? The bottom line is that as we make the turn into 2016 post-election, the US had no effective deterrence model at all for its cyber strategy, and in effect, no strategy whatsoever, which leads us to the development of our current new strategy instituted in 2018 by US Cyber Command, which goes by the name of Defend Forward and Persistent Engagement. Defend Forward is a defensive strategy that is intended to disrupt malicious actions at its source. So it's not a deterrence by denial, protection, and it's not a deterrence by countervailing force, that is threats to others, but rather the idea of getting inside of the enemy's decision loop, if you will, and disrupting his actions before they occur. This is designed to include military activity that is below the threshold of what we would traditionally consider armed conflict. It is intended to be forward positioned, both geographically with US military troops acting overseas, and more importantly, defending virtually in other people's networks outside the borders of the United States. It's intended to be proactive. It is said to be intended to observe, pursue, and then counter the cyber operations of our adversaries before they occur. And it necessarily involves US cyber operations in the physical territories of other nations. The most recent example that has been publicly disclosed is efforts by US Cyber Command to disrupt a ransomware bot known as the TrickBot network that involved activities both domestically and overseas. The second component of this is to realize that in the cyber domain, we must act persistently. That is, unlike in the physical domain, where a conflict begins and ends in a fixed period of time, typically, this conflict is ongoing at all times. And so our efforts in the United States, we say, are designed to identify threats on a persistent basis, on a continuous basis at all times. The third aspect of this policy that bears noting is that it is not a secret policy. It is a declaratory policy that has been publicly announced by the US government and US Cyber Command. As such, it is an effort to put other nations on notice that this is how the United States intends to proceed in response to the perceived threats to its own national interests. Now, the last point I would make before I close and offer to answer questions is that this policy is avowedly a self-defense policy. It is denominated Defend Forward by the United States and is intended to be used only in defense of our own national interests. I have to confess, even as an American analyst, that I'm not sure that that's exactly how it looks from the perspective of our foreign interlocutors. If I were living in Pakistan or in Russia or in China, America Defend Forward would look very much to me like US government in my networks. And that would, even though it was avowedly declared to be a defensive policy, have echoes of an offensive nature that are new and different, both in terms of the operational policy of the US government, in terms of the operational policy of nations around the world, in terms of global cyber norms, and in terms of international law. And with that, I will offer to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for sharing your shrewd insight. Yes, Ms. Zoe, your question first.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Siddiq, I interrupted you. I just had a quick question. Do you think that the declarative nature of the policy is a hindrance to its effectivity just because people are aware of what we're doing?
Well, that's a great question. Traditionally, the United States has believed that declaratory policies are more effective because we say what we mean and we mean what we say. And by doing so, we can effectively draw red lines. But typically in the past, those declaratory policies have involved technologies and capabilities that are not degraded by public exposure. Declaring your nuclear retaliation declaratory policy doesn't change your ability to launch nuclear missiles. That's different in this domain. And so there is indeed a serious concern that by speaking about our activity in this space, the United States is reducing its capability. I am aware that that very question was the subject of very serious and heated discussions within government before it was decided to make this policy public and declaratory. The only answer I can give you, Ms. Dabbs, is that we're engaged in an ongoing social experiment, and we may very well find out that that the U.S. government has made a mistake. It's not yet determined whether or not that's the case, and we may have degraded our capability more than the benefits we gain. But that's a predictive judgment that others have made as well, and I'm not capable of negating what they say.
Yeah, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Mr. Paul.
Yes.
Talking about the persistent engagement, an article was published last month in the Foreign Policy. It was, I guess, of the Paul Naganson. It stated that in the cyber realm, offense is the best defense. What is your comment?
Well, that is the nature of Defend Forward. General Nakasone is the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. And so he commands the American cyber troops that are responsible for implementing Defend Forward. And in saying that offense is the best defense, I think first off, he's stating a truism, which is that in the cyber domain where we are working, defense is very, very difficult, if not impossible, for your highest value assets. A persistent adversary will eventually succeed in disrupting your network. And so the only effective counter strategy that we've been able to develop so far is to hold at risk the offensive capabilities of adversaries overseas. And that means exercising offensive capabilities, albeit in a defensive, in the service of defense. As I said in the talk, there's a very fine line between exercising your offensive capabilities for defensive purposes, which is what the US declaratory policy is, and exercising those same offensive capabilities for offensive purposes, which is how some outside of the United States may very well perceive America's new policy. And the American policy is a response, as I said at the beginning, to the unfortunate strategic reality that we've got an asymmetric vulnerability going on. So it's pretty much what we have to do if we're going to be effective at all. But we are doing so, I think, with eyes wide open as to the likely skepticism with which that might be met overseas.
So, Mr. Hari Khan, I have a quick question.
Yes, good morning from here in Florida. It's for is it Dr. Rosenzweig or is just Mr. Rosenzweig? What is it?
I do not have a PhD, so I'm not a doctor.
All right. I consider PhD as, I live here in the University of Florida. There are one too many PhDs. And when I completed a master's a while back, one of my advisors actually told me, do you intend to get a job as a Pizza Hut delivery driver? And I said,
I like that.
Why is it? All right, let me, I would like your views. You kept on using the declarative policy of the United States in which you said it was defensive / offensive. Now, going back to the Bush Doctrine, which was based on preemption, are there a lot of, again, unclassified, are there a lot of preemptions, knowing that there's the enemy over there and United States with its allies and partners does get involved in preemptions?
Well, that's a great question. Part of the answer to that is that I can't really say, because much of this is behind classified, a classified cloak, and much of it I'm personally unaware of since I've been out of government for a number of years. There have been several public reports of what I think would fairly be characterized as preemptive activity by US Cyber Command in service of this new policy. The most prominent publicly reported such activity involved operations against Russian networks in the run-up to and execution of America's 2018 midterm elections, fearing a reprise of the Russian disinformation and disruption campaigns of 2016, US Cyber Command undertook and has publicly reported on a series of actions it took that were essentially offensive in nature, in the sense of taking adversaries offline and disrupting their communications activity, but were intended preemptively to prevent reciprocal Russian activity that was anticipated in respect of the 2018 election. So I think the answer is yes, that defend forward and persistent engagement have a component of preemption to them, of necessity in the cyber domain, where responding after this disruption to your own networks is typically too late to have any positive value for your own self-defense. I would almost be willing to say that by its nature, active cyber defenses have to be preemptive to some degree. The question is whether they're preemptive by an hour, a day, a week, or a year.
Thank you.
So a last question. I need a brief answer from you, Mr. Paul. It is about what is the implications of this, persistent engagement on the individual security and the civil liberties?
Well, if any military targeting necessarily implicates the civil liberties and civil rights of those who are targeted, if the targeting is in error. Obviously, under international law, if the targeting is accurate, then the conflict that you're engaged in makes the target a permissible one. The possibility of false positives, adverse action against people who ought not to be targeted is a real one, as it is in any action by any military in any conflict, whether it's kinetic or virtual. We have yet to see significant incorrect military targeting in the cyber domain, at least that's been publicly declared, certainly less so than in the kinetic domain. But that's certainly a cautionary note that we're going to have to keep in mind going forward and be aware of.